Before the beautiful game went full meta, before food points and ultimate teams, times were simpler. At a time when football games were still finding their formation, most studios were scrambling to stay onside in a crowded, confused market. The 90s weren't really the golden era for football and video games. Not yet. They were more a pre-season, full of awkward experiments, miss-sitters, and the occasional screamer. It wouldn't be until the mid-2000s that FIFA and Pro Evolution Soccer would truly emerge as the dominant clubs. But right in the middle of what was to come, FIFA 2000 came as a bizarre entry that jolted away from the initial series, yet was clearly not ready for the graphical revolution that was right around the corner. It mashed together licensed leagues, included the MLS, Arcade Flair, and Robbie Williams singing his heart out right from the intro. So lace up, this retrospective is about to kick off as we revisit one of EA Sports' most memorable misfits. It's the late 90s. EA has been running roughly the same thing for 3 years straight. FIFA 97, 98, and 99 all followed a similar formula and style. Licensed teams, slightly improved graphics, and iterative tweaks to gameplay. Most players were still firing up Windows 98, gaming on beige desktops and a ball mouse, and getting used to 3D graphics that now look like cardboard cutouts. Dial-up was the norm, CDs felt like cutting edge, and multiplayer was mostly meant dragging a second chair to the same keyboard. Meanwhile, the broader gaming scene during this time was active but fragmented. Actua Soccer 3 of 1998 marked the end of the series, offering decent visuals and a wide selection of teams. It's a shame they couldn't continue because I think they did have something special going on. While the visuals are pixelated due to the original PlayStation's hardware limitations, the way the stadiums and crowds were rendered I think were the best for its time. It's definitely better than anything that FIFA had done so far, including FIFA 2000 that came 2 years later. Seriously, take a look at the San Siro here. It looked fantastic all the way back in 98. This Is Football, developed by Team Soho for the PlayStation, introduced novel features like dives and shirt pulling, which added personality, and it would release just after FIFA 2000. ISS Pro 98, known in Japan as Winning 11-3, was Konami's best effort at the time. Tight, responsive gameplay and strong AI started to earn a cult following, but it still hadn't broken to the mainstream. Not yet. In short, while alternatives existed, some of which even exceeded FIFA on certain fronts, no single game was able to emerge as the dominant one just yet, leaving EA with little pressure to reinvent the wheel. But with FIFA 2000, they made a few changes. Were they enough though? FIFA 2000 landed at a time where its competition were beginning to push boundaries in gameplay and presentation. But EA still held the advantage in brand recognition and licensing. So when you fire up FIFA 2000, you're greeted with a flashy intro and a burst of Robbie Williams energy. But once you're in, it becomes clear that while the presentation had been polished, the core formula hadn't changed all that much. Still, before diving into how it plays, it's worth unpacking the game modes that kept players coming back. In terms of actual content, FIFA 2000 gave players the usual mix to dive into. You had the classic exhibition mode for quick matches, full domestic league seasons, and various cup competitions to compete in. It wasn't overly complex, but it gave you enough variety to keep things interesting. You would get the sentence or two from the main commentator John Motson as you finished games, but even after playing through the whole World Cup, the whole ceremony, if you could call it that, was very basic, and the trophy didn't even look like the World Cup either, despite having the correct image on the menus. It was kind of like half-licensed, if that's a thing, so I'm not sure what was going on there. The post-cup statistics and the experience overall was very surface level, and that was evident. Beyond the game modes, FIFA continued to stand out in its range of leagues and official licenses. The game featured a plethora of leagues, including major ones such as the English Premier League, the Spanish La Liga, Italian Serie A, German Bundesliga, and many more. But more importantly for me, the Turkish League as well for the first time. Furthermore, Major League Soccer from the United States was the main highlight of the game as a means to push to the North American market. In fact, they were the only ones with fully licensed kits in the game. I'm sure this mattered for the 10 people who used to watch the MLS back in the 90s. That said, for me personally, there were two more omissions that were a complete letdown. First, despite the existence of the Turkish League, the Turkish national team was missing. Second, the omission of Galatasaray was also a big bummer, especially after it was already included in FIFA 99. And funnily enough, the 99-2000 squad of Galatasaray went on to win the UEFA Cup by defeating Arsenal in penalties, and later the UEFA Super Cup by winning 2-1 with a golden goal in extra time against none other than Real Madrid. Those back-to-back European titles still remain the only European silverware won by a Turkish team, even a quarter of a century later. A fact I'm not particularly happy about. But anyway, FIFA 2000 still offered over 40 national teams and a number of classic all-star teams with legendary retired players, such as the 70s teams of Argentina and Brazil. The lower number of national teams was a step back, but this installment overall continued the significant expansion in FIFA's global representation of club and international football, and would continue to serve the foundation of one of the few advantages it would have over its main competition from Konami, which was breathing down its neck. While the game modes offered variety, one other notable omission stood out: the stadium selection. Unlike FIFA 98 and 99, which featured a decent number of recognizable real-world stadiums, FIFA 2000 mostly stuck to generic venues. There are a couple that resemble actual stadiums. One looks a lot like the San Siro of the Milan clubs, and another has hints of the Camp Nou of Barcelona. But nothing is officially licensed. Worse still, you couldn't even select the stadium, so even from the pool of generic venues, players had no control over the setting. This definitely felt like a step back, especially for those who valued the authenticity and immersive atmosphere of real stadiums in previous titles. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about something that was always fun for me: customization. The customization options from the previous games came back in FIFA 2000, and just like both in FIFA 98 and 99, it was and still is one of my favorite parts of the game. You could mess around with the kits, change the shirts, shorts, and socks for every team, switch up the colors and designs, all of it. As a kid, I had so much fun playing around with that stuff. Continuing with off-the-field options, FIFA 2000 also introduced a basic transfer budget system, but it wasn't part of a larger career or management mode. When you went to the transfer menu, each team had a set budget and players had assigned values. You could swap players between clubs, but only if the receiving team could afford the move, at least according to the game's internal pricing. It added a tiny layer of realism, as there was no long-term financial tracking or progression, and the budget existed mostly as a soft cap or a limitation during squad customization. That said, you could bypass the budget constraint using a particular cheat, but more on that later. Visually, FIFA 2000 marked a noticeable evolution from its predecessors, which had remained relatively unchanged the past 3 installments. However, despite the technical upgrades, it still didn't feel like a true leap into the future. It retained many of the low-texture aesthetics that characterized 90s sports games. The Millennium's graphical revolution was just around the corner, with FIFA 2001 poised to deliver a significant jump in visual fidelity. But FIFA 2000 just wasn't it. That said, we all know that graphics aren't everything, so let's just focus on the real question. How did the football hold up itself on the field?
Here they come then for the second half.
Despite looking like an actually new game with a new direction and improvements from a visual perspective, the football itself had not really progressed that much. This is despite using motion graphics for the first time, which was very clearly advertised in the intro cinematic of the game. So even though the skeletal movement of players had an improvement from an animation perspective, I suppose the football itself didn't really improve. If we're being honest here, the simulation on the field was far away from how football was actually being played, especially given how jarring and abrupt the animation remained. For example, one of the few things that pulled you out of the experience in FIFA 2000 was how players could steer the ball's direction via Bluetooth. In other words, the ball was magnetically glued to the player wherever he faced outside of passing and shooting. It was this slightly floaty, unrealistic mechanic that had remained in the series up until this point, and FIFA 2000 didn't fix it. Now, for those of you who are not old enough to make the argument that, hey, that was 25 years ago, and perhaps they didn't have the technology at the time, well, that's not really an excuse, because Konami would release its then fantastic football game the same year that would live up to becoming EA's headache for at least the next decade. Its gameplay mechanics were head and shoulders beyond what FIFA had achieved so far, but that's a topic for another video. In short, the competition was able to successfully integrate proper ball physics, and EA's lack of innovation had already caught up to them. Another major lack of improvement here is that you could not set the power level of anything, including passes, through passes, crosses, or shots. So all you had to do was point it the right direction and pray that the player does what you intend him to do at the power level that you wanted. Penalties and corners or other set pieces also did not have an improvement over FIFA 99. But one thing that we can perhaps give credit to FIFA 2000 was for its goalkeepers' overall better reactions and saving animations compared to what we had before. But yeah, apart from what I've mentioned, gameplay was overall nothing to write home about, and although the game's engine and overall visuals felt different, it wasn't necessarily for better or for worse. Another really frustrating thing about the game were the referees, and I promise you, I'm not being your local clueless lad from the pub. Here, take a look at some of the challenges that I watched in disbelief. You can very clearly see the defender completely obliterating the ankle of Ronaldo from behind, and not only does he not get a red card, but the referee doesn't even call the foul or the penalty. I know that referee strictness is an option in the menu, but even then, clear misses like these that are just hilarious to see kind of take you out of the experience as well. I believe that's because completely missing the ball when tackling an opponent either does not seem to be a strict requirement for the refereeing rules, or the game simply does not have something to detect it. That said, dirty tackling for the purposes of injuring or just messing around with a goalkeeper to get a red card was still a part of the game and something that I admittedly enjoyed doing as a kid. It was somehow fun for some reason to take out your frustration as a kid when you were losing and just get 5 red cards and default the game to a loss. Okay, now that we've gone over how the football itself plays out, let's not forget about the oddball charm FIFA 2000 had tucked away, the cheats and the celebrations.
Another look at the goal. The referee but to give a free kick there for the strike of the ball. Brilliant finish here.
One of the things that I love about classic games is their inclusion of fun, silly cheats that add so much personality to each of them. FIFA 2000 was no exception here, and the selection they gave us was actually pretty fun. You had the Mo Money code, which gave you unlimited transfer funds, basically letting you stack any team however way you'd like. Then there was Hooligan, which unlocked some bonus teams and mostly just EA staff squads, but it was cool to mess around with. I was curious and skimmed through the stats of the developers, and 2 of them stood out. Our friends Lawson from Team EA1 and McBride from Team EA3, who have their stats almost maxed out at 7 out of 7s across the board. For reference, here's the stats from Peak Ronaldo of Brazil and Zizou of France. My man Lawson is such a giga chad that as a striker, his tackling is even better than Maldini's. And they gave Maldini only 6 out of 7 for tackling? Really? But anyway, fooling around with the EA teams aside, the cheats that really stood out were the visual ones. Burnaby took you to EA Canada's Burnaby studio. It looked like a training ground in front of their corporate headquarters. And if you squinted your eyes and counted the pixels, you could see their old logo on the building's entrance in its glorious low texture form. You can also see some very low texture people watching the game, which I assume were photos of the developers themselves. Hey, if there are any developers who worked on the game watching this by any chance, would love to hear from you and get some additional context to the details of this field. I personally love seeing little Easter eggs like this tucked away in games to be found and cherished decades later. Moving on, the cheat Sizzle turned on lightning mode, where random bolts of lightning would flash during matches, and any player struck by it would instantly get fried and disappear. From a game perspective, it was similar to just receiving a red card, but this was hilarious in a way of randomly removing players with just a pretty funny animation. In fact, this didn't even stop during the cutscenes, which added to the silliness. The cheat Dizzy unlocked Alien Mode, and yeah, it was as weird as it sounded. Similar to Sizzle, Alien Mode also removes players from the game. However, as far as I know, this only impacted you and your team as a game mode to be more challenging against the opponent, a handicap of sorts. Hence, one of your players would randomly get abducted by an alien ship that's continuously circling around in the field. It's funny seeing it flying around casually during replays as well. Lights Out gave you glow mode, where the entire pitch went black and all you could see were these glowing outlines of the players like neon ghosts kids playing football in the void. And finally, even though this wasn't necessarily a cheat, the game had a sepia tone to it whenever classic teams were selected, which added atmosphere to those games when playing with old teams. It's nice touches like these that make you remember many years later. Speaking of things that added some flair, the celebrations in this game were also rather funny. I remember one in particular standing out in which you basically gave your goal-scoring teammate a complimentary brain damage by thrusting yourself right behind their neck and yelling at them right after as they fell to the ground. I remember it being so absurd as a kid, and I laughed again as I experienced it once more as an adult. Most of the other goal celebrations are either silly or fun overall, but the standout thing here for myself and many others was that there was actual expression on the players' faces for the first time. Even if they looked like a handful of polygons by today's standards, we could clearly see the movements of their eyebrows as well as their mouths. And you could tell the players' emotions, which was honestly a great touch for its time and definitely an improvement over previous installments. Look, of all classic FIFA games, I wouldn't necessarily say that FIFA 2000 was my favorite, as that title still remains with FIFA 98, which sits very close to my heart. I don't think that FIFA 2000 had the charm that 98 or even 99 had, and it definitely did not have the graphical revolution that FIFA 2001 boasted just a year later. So it was this awkward middle child that didn't really fit with the 90s installments, and neither with the 2000s and beyond. However, its charming soundtrack alongside the promise of something new on the horizon from FIFA and EA was still an important part of my childhood that I will cherish. So thank you to my fellow Canadians at EA Burnaby for making this game a quarter of a century ago, even with all of its flaws that I'm only able to pinpoint as an adult today.